Okay, Yoel here for Hebrew in Israel, and I've been asked multiple times by different people to do a reading of the Lord's Prayer. And um, though what we have in front of us here is actually a translation of the Lord's Prayer and not the Lord's Prayer in Greek, which is the usual one that we see, and the English translation, which most people in the Western world know of. It is important to point that out because we actually do not have a Hebrew Matthew or any gospel really written in original Hebrew. Though some church fathers do mention the idea that there is, I think there's at least one church father mentions the idea that there is a Hebrew Matthew. We do not have a Hebrew Matthew. All the Hebrew Matthews that people talk about that we have that pop up in different places are all translations, usually Jewish translations that were done in late medieval times or during the Renaissance as part of Jewish polemics against Christianity. For example, the Shem Tov is a translation. It actually says in the introduction to it that it was translated from Greek into Hebrew. So one of the things that has to be dispelled is that we actually do not have a Hebrew Matthew written in original Hebrew. The earliest manuscripts, the earliest fragments of the New Testament that we have are all in Greek. So this is very, very important. Also, there's a very good chance that this prayer originally was actually said in Aramaic. And but because the tendency in Judaism is to actually pray in Hebrew, it is very possible that Yeshua may have actually presented this in Hebrew and Aramaic. But we have to remember that he was talking in the Galilee to many people that Hebrew was probably not a language that they mastered very, very well. Again, there's no way of knowing for sure. There are discussions about people speaking more than two languages. Some people probably spoke a little bit of Hebrew, probably a lot of Aramaic, and maybe some broken form of Greek. It's a really, really good question. There's discussions about this in historical discussions about the Jews of this period. Hebrew would have been a language that most people would have recognized, but Aramaic probably was one of those languages that people knew very, very, very well. And therefore, what we have here is basically a reconstruction into Hebrew of probably an Aramaic prayer. It's not too difficult to reconstruct into Hebrew. The problem is with Greek, because when we deal with Greek translations, and we deal with, for example, even if the words were said in Hebrew or Aramaic, they were transferred into Greek, and in Greek, usually there's a problem that there's no always exact equivalent to what was said in the Semitic language, which is also a problem we have with the Septuagint. It's always clear what exactly stood in front of the translator and so on, and therefore it just has to be prefaced that this is a Hebrew reconstruction of probably an Aramaic text. However, because we mostly deal with Hebrew, it is much more it's much more logical for us to say this in Hebrew anyhow. And even though if requested, I can also do an Aramaic version of this, which will probably be closer to what they would have said back then. So the prayer itself, I have a document also that deals with the very strong Jewish background of this. It is also very interesting that he doesn't tell them anything in the style of the Amidah, which is the 18 benedictions used to this very day in Judaism. At this time, probably such a prayer, even though we have some references in the Mishnah to parts of the Amidah, part of the Shmoneh Esrei, being used in the temple, this is probably maybe retrospective and maybe even trying to impose anachronistic descriptions of prayer from the rabbinic period into the Second Temple era. Yaakov Kahneman does try to make a point that there is a possibility that maybe some elements of the Amidah were already used in the temple. But we have to remember that these are Jews who lived in rural areas, and they were probably mostly not involved in those parts of Jewish culture, and therefore when they turn around to Yeshua and say, teach us how to pray, they're literally looking for a form to pray, because we know that, for example, in the Dead Sea Scrolls, in the Yachad, they probably prayed certain forms of collecting different types of the Book of Psalms. There's actually a Book of Psalms that was researched by Pfan, 11Q, Psalms, don't remember which reference it is exactly at the end, A, B, C, whatever, which one it is, because there's lots of Book of Psalms from then. And what you end up with is this amalgamated text, this hybrid text that has very specific psalms set up together in a different order than we're used to seeing. We also know that they had the Sabbath ascent prayers as well. So this does fall within that world of freehand prayer or prayer used by text. Here is giving them freehand prayer, basically giving them the most basic format of prayer. And we also find elements of this that go into Jewish prayer today, even to this very day. And this is why I said years ago to Keith Johnson, for those who don't know who he is, he's an old friend of mine, and one of the people pushed me into, or convinced me to go into teaching Hebrew. And I said to him, this is a very, very Jewish prayer. So there's a lot of Jewish elements here, which you can also see in the attached document. So it says, Avinu shebashamayim, yitkadash shemecha, תבוא מלכותך, יעשה רצונך, כמו בשמיים כן בארץ. את לחם חוקנו תן לנו היום, וסלח לנו את חובותינו, כאשר סלחנו גם אנחנו לחייבנו, ואל תביאנו לידי ניסיון, כי אם חלצנו מן הרע, כי לך הממלכה והגבורה והתפארת לעולמי עולמים. Amen. Now I'm going to put this on a document as well, because I know that as I'm going over the words, I'm covering up the vowel points, so you can just look at the document as well. There are many, many Jewish principles here, and also be careful with the word hamamlacha, because the inclination here is kind of to do a close syllable, but it's not really a full close syllable. And as you can see, I kind of stuttered over it as well. Hamamlacha. Okay, hamamlacha. It's almost a full stop, but not really. There are also interesting things, like, for example, Ve'al tavienu li'idei nisayon. There's a Jewish prayer to this very day that's said every single day that has pretty much this line in it. Okay, but let's start from the beginning. Avinu shebashamayim, like Avinu malkenu, referring to Shamayim in the heavens. Yitkadash shemecha. This is very similar, reminiscent of Yitgadal v'Yitkadash. Okay, referring to God as Kadosh, 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 is Isaiah 6. The concept of Malchutecha, the kingdom. People were talking about the kingdom to come, and so on. So this is something that we find in Jewish literature at the time. Doing His will in heaven and earth. Koneh shamayim va'aretz, the creator of heaven and earth. It means He controls them. Et lechem chukenu, our daily bread, give us today. This is the concept of hatrifeni lechem chuki. This is in the book of Psalms. Forgiveness, big theme during this period. So when we say salach lanu avinu ki chatanu mechal lanu ki fashanu chichanu ata merbe lislach, this is from the Amidah. This is the fifth benediction of the Amidah. As I said, al tevinu deniseva ki im chaletzenu min hara. Ra'i here is not evil in the way most Christians think. Ra here is not. It is usually a reference here because it parallels the word nisayon, which deals with the idea of being tested. This is avoidance of sin. This is not some demonic beings or devils and so on. This is just do not allow us to be tempted by evil deeds and so on, not by evil beings. And then Hamamlacha v'Gevura v'Tiferet, if I'm not mistaken, that's actually in the book of Chronicles. The prayer of David in the book of Chronicles. So he's doing a classic thing that we find in Judaism of the period, which is the usage of verses and then using them to create prayer. Jewish prayer to this very day is very verse-based heavy. What he does here is he's basically doing something we find in other places, but instead of doing complete quotes, as for example we do in Siddur today, what we actually find is a referencing to verses, basically allusions to verses, which is something that we find in the Dead Sea Scrolls. I actually, one of the plans I originally had for my master's thesis, which I ended up doing something else. I know there's a researcher out there doing her PhD on this topic. She may have actually been done already. I don't know. I never got updates on that one. But one of the interesting things is that we find that in, for example, the book of Psalms, in Psalm 119, there are allusions to other places in the Bible. So alluding to from place to place. Daniel in his prayer, in Daniel, Daniel 9, he alludes he talks about the book of Jeremiah, but he alludes to other places as well. But mostly the book of Jeremiah, we find in the Bible this concept of alluding from place to place, where a writer of one book is aware of another book, and therefore he's alluding to what's being said there. And sometimes we even have direct quotations. You just have to pay attention that they're there. So Yeshua is continuing here a classic practice that we find in the Bible and done in Second Temple practices, and then later on also in Jewish prayer and Jewish literature, we allude from one place to the other. So this is the Lord's Prayer in Hebrew with some references, and I hope this helps you understand the concept of this prayer, and especially how Jewish this prayer is. Kol Tov.